so maybe I don't need to do that anymore. Yes? No?
No, you're good.
You know what else? If you flipped it, the camera would be on the higher part. If you need it higher. Right?
It's not gonna stay.
Got it.
The film's upside down. I did that.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right. So.
Are you already recording?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we won't use this for Spark. So can you tell me about the church you attend and how long you've been going there?
So my wife and I, we are members at Bethel Church of the Nazarene here in Quincy, Massachusetts. It is in the Germantown neighborhood, technically the Germantown, it's on the Germantown Peninsula. We have been a part of that congregation since 2009. So when we first came out here, actually. So you can do the math on that. What was that? 8 years? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What is your stance on tolerance and the church's role in dealing with racism? Do you believe that it's the church's job to play an active role in fighting against it?
Fighting against
Racism.
tolerance?
Racism.
What was the question?
What is your stance on tolerance and the church's role in dealing with racism? And then, do you believe that it's the church's job to play an active role in fighting against racism?
Trying to understand why you threw tolerance in there. I don't have to answer that. I'm just trying to think about the question without that. So basically, what do I think is the church's role regarding racism?
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you mind if I ask what your operational definition of racism is in your project?
That's a good question. I don't know if we've actively defined it yet.
Okay.
But, I don't know.
Okay. Just because, you know, some folks, when they hear the term racism, their first thought is whether or not a person is individually racist. So their thought would be, you know, what do you do about the fact that some people hate other people because of their race, according to the United States race categorization system? And from one perspective, racism is about an individual's thoughts about another person or another group of people. Racism, however, could also include a more, the typical term would be a systemic view, where you look at the way bias regarding various groups makes its way into the structures of things, the way policies are put together, the way hiring happens, the way school, like college acceptance, admissions processes happen, the way zoning happens, you know, that sets up various areas of a state to vote, you know, in certain ways, to vote, and then how their votes get counted, whether or not a particular state requires a driver's license to vote, and how that could affect the situation if certain communities don't have, you know, particular forms of ID, and like all of that kind of stuff. So that's another way people talk about racism, is the more systemic view. So obviously the church has some important work to do there, actually in both cases. So in this idea of an individual having negative thoughts, feelings, or even pursuing negative, like harmful actions against another group because of race, obviously the church has a role and responsibility to call that out and to even be a part of helping, of being a part of God's mission to change hearts, you know. But obviously people get formed in those ways partly because of the systems that say that that's okay and that that's normal. And the church also has a responsibility to call that out as well. Unfortunately, and here's where it just gets so frustrating, is the options that are before us oftentimes pit people in like a political category: Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. So I think that our responsibility is to engage these matters without tying ourselves to a political agenda, whether that's Republican or Democrat or left or right or whatever. But also, we need to engage these issues without being afraid of the ways that certain parties may jump on it and affirm or reject. Because the way the church operates in the world has to be of a different framework than Republican or Democrat. And some things we do may fit well with Republicans, and some things we do may fit well with Democrats, but ultimately we're different. We're the church. And some things we do will connect with one or the other or both, and some things we do will not connect with one or the other or both. So
to what extent do you think it should be a priority? Like, some people I've talked to think unless it's actively happening in the church, then it shouldn't really be high on the list of things to address.
Okay, so if there's not racism happening, so the question you're saying is, if people don't see racism happening in their congregation, is there still a need to address it? I mean, my answer to that is pretty easy. I mean, the answer is yes, there's a responsibility to address it, but I'm trying to avoid just giving a quick answer like that. Let's just put it this way. If you're in a congregation that's in a neighborhood or a town that's predominantly one racial group, right? Whether that's white or black or Asian American or just one racial group, it's going to be hard for that church community to point out racism in the church, because their automatic framework would be, how could there be racism? There's no one else but us, right? And if that's the case, what that's also saying is, because there's no one else but us, we're unable to see our racism. And so it's important for the church to help folks uncover that so that it can be transformed.
So how often have you heard a sermon discussing the problem of racism and what the church should be doing to combat it?
A sermon. Well, I guess I'd say it's kind of interesting. This year in chapel, in light of all that's been happening in the world, and especially in the United States over the past couple of years, past few years really, I would say that we've had a few folks address racism. We had someone in the fall talk about it. He was an older white male who served in leadership in his church, in the Church of the Nazarene actually. And he addressed race head on. We had Soong Chan Ra, and that person is Jesse Middendorf. Soong Chan Ra, when he was here for the MLK week, he did as well. And I'd say others have in their own way, not as direct. But despite the intentionality of this year, I will say it is rarely touched. And I think that's just because of how quick it can be interpreted as a political agenda. You know, we are so formed by left, right, Democrat, Republican, that when someone touches these things, our ears are so quick to try to hear which box they fit in. And So I think because of that, a lot of folks who preach just try to avoid it so they don't get put into a box.
So, have you ever noticed a lack of diversity in your congregation or felt any racial tension between the members?
Yeah, I mean, the congregation that I'm a part of, interestingly, is in one of the most diverse, racially and culturally diverse areas of Quincy.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a predominantly white congregation. We began attending that congregation, being a part of that congregation, partly because of invitation, but I also began by working with the youth group there a little bit, just volunteering. And the youth group for a while was very, very diverse. But it's interesting. I've noticed that the adult life of the congregation is not. And actually, Jenny and I, we've been talking about this a lot recently, and just wondering what's happening there. And even the teens who tend to then be a part of the church as adults. We've been there since 2009, so we've seen teens transition to adulthood. And it's interesting to see that the teens who had transitioned to adulthood and stay part of the church, whether or not they live in the neighborhood, it always tends to be the white students who stay plugged in and then live out their adult life with the church. So, yeah, it's been actually something we've been noticing that we are wondering about. Actually, just mentioned that to the pastor, within the last month.
Do you think it could be, or do you think the influence of racism not being confronted in the church could play a factor into that, or how it?
Well, that's funny, because I think a lot of people there would say that racism is confronted there. It's actually a congregation that's very open about thinking about justice issues. But truthfully, sometimes we talk so much about things and have a hard time knowing where to begin action. And so I think if you were to preach a sermon on this very topic in this particular congregation, people would say, amen, But that's one thing. It's another thing to then ask if we should change the way we do music, or if, or to ask, who you're intentionally becoming friends with, who you're inviting into your home to have a meal. I mean, this is really how you live the life of church. You pray together, you eat together, you hang out together. Sunday morning is just where everyone comes together and expresses the praise as a collective, but that means nothing if throughout the week you're not building those relationships. And I think that's the tough part. It's, are you willing to become friends with people who are different than yourself? And are you open to going through the potential conflicts that are at play? I don't know if we're as committed to those kinds of friendships. I mean, some are in the congregation, but as a congregation, maybe not as much. It's not a critique on the congregation. It's just, I think it also is, that congregation that we're a part of is so focused on justice issues. I think it just would feel strange to try to throw another one in there, be like, oh my goodness, like, we're really engaged in things. Like, how could it be the case that all of a sudden, like, we're doing something wrong? I think it would be a shocker. Like, we're doing something wrong, and maybe some things need to be done to see if it's being done wrong. So that was a whole lot. Hopefully, like, you edit 90% of that.
Do you believe avoiding the topic in church feeds into stereotypes and prejudices people have in day-to-day life? And can you think of any examples of this happening?
Well, there's enough research out there that shows that congregations that are multicultural actually avoid the conversation of race because there is an attempt to try to find, or congregations that are multiracial tend to avoid really addressing the issues of race because what is actually attempted is to try to find commonality around something other than like dismantling racism, like it's commonality around the neighborhood or commonality around interests, like this is a group that's really into this kind of stuff. So you would look at a congregation like that and actually think, hey, I guess they're fine. But what enough research has shown is actually those are congregations where there are just unspoken tensions, and it's often folks who lack access to what's ever dominant in that space. It's often those folks who just feel like I better stay quiet because I don't want to cause a problem. And when you have moments like that, when you have those situations like I better stay quiet because I don't want people to think that I'm like always thinking about how racism's at play. When you have that fear, then you do know you have an issue. I mean, we're not called to live in that kind of fear of each other, fear to address injustice. So
if pastors started talking about racism more, what do you think would happen? Like, would people be uncomfortable, or would it really change anything?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean by that question, but I think that question comes back to that whole issue of talking. So if pastors start talking about racism more, what do I think would happen? I think people would get tired of it and they'd leave the churches. They'd say, people would try to figure out what box they fit in. Are they talking about racism through a Republican lens? Are they talking about racism through a Democrat lens, or a right-wing lens, or a left-wing lens? I think people would really spin their wheels trying to figure that out. And then whenever they figure out what box they want to put that preacher in, they'll decide, do I like that box or do I want to go somewhere else? I mean, that's a pessimistic answer, I guess, but I don't think the answer is preachers talking about it more. I think the real question is, well, no, you asked a real question. I think what could be more helpful than pastors talking about it more are pastors partnering with other churches. So if you have a church in a neighborhood or a town that's predominantly one, racial group, and so the church is predominantly one racial group, how cool would it be if they intentionally became friends with a congregation in a totally different neighborhood or town that has a different racial makeup, and those congregations, they spent time hearing each other's stories. So you're not just having this pastor talk about race, but you're actually having people build friendships across lines of racial difference. I think that's when you do some things that are real. And I mean, that will lead to some moments of conflict. But the testimony of the gospel is that God can bring new life out of that conflict, and that resurrection power can take place right there. So.
Okay. The last question I have is, do you have any personal experience with a church that is working against racism and trying to include other people? Yeah,
I mean, my research is actually on congregations that are trying to do that. So the answer is yes. And some do it well, and some don't do it well. And but there's a lot of good intentions involved. But of course, you can't just have good intentions. You have to have intentionality, which is a little bit different. So, what was the question again? Oh, have I seen any that do it really well? try to avoid the language. I try to avoid highlighting exemplars because it's often systems of dominance that discern what the exemplars are. So I'll say that I have encountered congregations and Christians who have built friendships across lines of difference that's categorized by race. And I have seen that happen well. And it often involves eating together, hanging out together, praying together, and being open to the ways in which the other worships, and engaging in that not as a voyeur, but engaging in that as receiving something that's being shared with you by a friend.
That's all the questions I have, but if you have anything else you'd like to add, feel free.
No, but I think it's cool that you got all your groups are working on really cool stuff. So I'm glad you're changing the world.